This is TWiT.
This week, Apple got the charges from the EU that the App Store is a monopoly. This is at the behest of Spotify. Antitrust violations in the Spotify case. There's Marta Vestager, the Competition Commission at the EU. She's really become the pit bull against big tech in the United States. EU regulators say Apple squeezed rival music streaming apps, Spotify, which is, where this came from, by requiring them to use Apple's in-app payment systems to sell digital content. They also say Apple distorted competition, that's the phrase they used, by limiting how app developers can inform users about cheaper ways to subscribe. This is a long-standing problem. Amazon didn't sell books in the Kindle store on iOS, and when they had the temerity to say, oh, by the way, you can buy these books on Amazon.com, Apple said, you can't say that. Apple's in-payment system, of course, charges 30% for most people. They've now lowered that for people that make more than $1 million a year, which is all the big boys, to 15%. There's a second data point on this. I don't know how much credibility to give it, but, Apple's tomorrow, Apple's going to go to court with Epic. The big battle has begun. Epic has hired an expert to analyze documents obtained from Apple and Discovery. Ned Barnes, he's a financial and economics researcher, said Apple has a 78% margin in the App Store. 78% profit. Is Apple's App Store... It's obviously a problem for Apple now. They're getting a lot of scrutiny, but is it really? Is there a good reason for it to be a problem, Brianna? Is there something wrong with the way Apple's doing it?
Well, I think this is a hard situation to talk about, right? Like, no one that is a fan of iOS or the Apple ecosystem wants them to open this up to competitors. Part of what keeps all of us safe is, the curation and the limiting of who's able to run apps in the App Store. Just to really be frank with you, Leo, the only reason I stay on iOS is the privacy.
Right.
There's no other reason. It's not the features. It's not the hardware. So that's one side of it. But on the other, I think it's really increasingly difficult to say, Apple deserves that high a cut. What value are they really producing to earn that 30%? It's not payment processing, which is cheaper than ever. It's not really discovery, because the App Store tends to favor the biggest fish and, people that can afford to do their own marketing. What are they providing here? As far as the profit itself, wow, stunner, headline, monopolies and duopolies are insanely profitable. Who would have known that? So, I think that if Apple doesn't want to be increasingly under the gun of regulators, I think it would be smart of them to bring that down to a margin that's frankly doesn't seem as exploitive.
The number 78% isn't confirmed by Apple. In fact, they asked the judge, can we not talk about this? They literally said to the judge, Your Honor, let's not talk about this. And I don't know, the judge hasn't ruled yet, but somehow I feel like that might be material in the Epic case. Apple's services segment, according to Apple's own quarterly results, and services includes Apple App Store, but other things, is 70%. The gross margin for its products is 36%. This is an incredibly profitable company, making an awful lot of money. But is that illegal? Nate, what do you think? You're from a former member of the EU.
Yeah, I follow this stuff closely, and frankly, Apple's hardware margins on iPhone used to be a lot higher than they used to be. I think they were even comparable to some of the margins that we're talking about for App Store that this analyst was discussing.
When you combine services and products, the total gross margin for the quarter was 42.5%. That's a phenomenally successful company. I mean, I know my company is not nearly so profitable. But I would guess most companies would be very happy with anything above 10%, maybe 20%. 42.5%. Wow.
But I think so. There's a few ways of looking at it because, on the one hand, you could say, well, there's nothing wrong with a company being profitable, making money. That's kind of what capitalism is predominantly all about. And the question is whether it's being abused and whether it could, whether that profitability and that market position is being abused, and if so, what needs to change in order for it not to be. And I don't believe that the EU is going to take as much of an issue with the profitability of the App Store from the perspective that, well, you could just make less profit. And actually, it will come down to, well, are you artificially prohibiting people who depend on your App Store from circumventing your payment platform? So if you look at what Apple did with the sign-in with Apple system, where if you offer a sign-in with Facebook or Google, you have to also offer sign-in with Apple. Apple can push the benefits of choosing Apple over the others by saying, well, look, it's more private, it's faster, it uses Face ID to authenticate, you're not typing in your password, all of which is true. And it offers a user that ability to say, well, I'm going to choose Apple to do this because it's faster and more convenient. If Apple were to be forced or choose to allow another form of payment system within an app, essentially the user, as Epic demonstrated with the Fortnite case that kind of spearheaded a lot of this stuff, that you give someone a choice and they can go with Apple and it might cost more money, but it's tied into the payment system. It's done without going to a separate web page, like when you have to pay with PayPal or something. Like, you could see that, well, there's a legitimate argument that people are still going to use Apple because it's just faster and more convenient. So I think that is probably what will end up being talked about a lot more than just the sheer profitability. I mean, if you want to look at profit margins, look at the fashion industry. It's crazy.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, a Rolex watch is a very much more than 42% profit, I'm sure. Yeah.
So I think that's what it probably will come down to. And just one other thing that I thought is worth pointing out is this reminds me a lot of the conversation that went around at the sort of turn of the millennium with Microsoft and its antitrust battle with the EU.
Very much so.
Yeah, I mean, but the result for Microsoft was essentially that it lost its ground on a lot of products and like browsers, obviously in particular. I think Windows Media Player suffered, and I think that kind of had a knock-on effect that Microsoft was maybe less willing to be as aggressive in pushing its products against competitors than it may otherwise would have if it wasn't scared of antitrust. And I'm going to be looking out for whether, whatever the result of this happens, whatever decisions made, whatever appeals are made or overturned, is whether this changes Apple's aggressive pursuit of dominating its ecosystem, or whether it will eventually end up ceding ground in a way Microsoft did. And I think that's going to be fascinating.
I'm sure there'll be debate over this, but I agree with you. I think even though the DOJ Microsoft battle, which went on for almost a decade, ended up, kind of in a draw, it tempered Microsoft's aggression. It's certainly, I think you make a strong case that Google, for instance, might not have existed if Microsoft hadn't been more careful about entering markets. You can also make the case that it's not been bad for Microsoft, that they have, as a result, found new areas to make money in. And that's actually, I don't think you can look at Microsoft today and say they suffered because of what happened in the late 90s and the early 2000s with the DOJ.
I mean, the company's worth over $2 trillion at this point.
Yeah.
And it lost the Windows Phone battle. I mean, if you would look at an example of maybe how Microsoft would have approached a market opportunity more aggressively were it not for fears over antitrust, look at Windows Phone.
Perfect.
Like that was not a product that should have failed, really. It had everything going for it in terms of the people who could have pushed it harder and didn't. And
That's
eventually
interesting.
It lost out.
I have never heard
Google
anybody
now.
say that's why they lost the Windows Phone market. Usually it's the carrier stores in the U.S. that are blamed for not.
I don't think exclusively. I think it was just a part.
It makes sense.
There were
though.
other things wrong with it.
Microsoft certainly was chastened and was much less aggressive. In a way, we've lost because it would be great to have another standard besides iOS and Android. So, and it was, I think Windows Phone was great, but so the customer has lost a little bit. But I don't think a less rapacious Microsoft is a bad thing in general. overall.
I just want to come back to this issue. I think because I'm looking at the Club Twitch chat, I don't think any of us here begrudge any tech company for doing very well and making a lot of money. I don't think anyone here has any kind of problem with that. My interest in this really begins and ends when you have companies that are so large that we cannot continue to have innovation in the tech industry. And I think we have to be asking ourselves, could you launch another Facebook today without that being gobbled up by Facebook? Could you have a really strong hardware manufacturer come along today with an operating system and compete with Apple or Microsoft? I think the answer is increasingly probably not.
Wow.
So my only interest here is making sure we can continue to foster innovation in the tech industry. Because if we don't, this thing that all of us love, it's just going to stagnate. And I think we are unfortunately seeing that in many ways.
Competition.
And even for those startups who do fit within this ecosystem, who could write an app that will fit within, App Store guidelines, now need to make 30% additional margins on their end just to break even because of the high fees that Apple is charging. If you think of your average retail space, there isn't a shopping mall on the planet that would take 30% off of all the sales of any of their stores and expect for those stores to survive. But that's exactly what Apple's doing. And it's hard for that to not look egregious. And regarding margins, I love that Apple's response to the margins wasn't, this is invalid, this is wrong. It was, we actually don't calculate that, and we can't calculate that, which is totally BS. Of course they calculate. Of course they know that. Just because they don't report it doesn't mean they don't have a number ready and waiting.
We don't know. We have no idea how much we make. No idea at all. By the way, they're spending $90 billion to buy back stock. They announced that as well in the quarterly results. That's a huge amount, and that will, of course, inflate the stock price even further, which means that people who own Apple stock, probably members of Congress, will be very well disposed towards Apple. It also means that employees will get, bigger stock grants and so forth.